Welcome again, everyone. We're going to get started in about 30 seconds with our event. So we'll begin today's event by welcoming our distinguished guests and panelists and all of you to this important virtual discussion of a book that was released last year called The United States, Southeast Asia, and Historical Memory, which is edited by Mark Pavlik and Carolyn Luft and has chapters authored by our panelists that have joined us today for this discussion. My name is Brian Eiler. I am the director of the Stimson Center Southeast Asia program and also the chair of the Stimson Center's War Legacies Working Group, which I'm going to introduce it very quickly in a moment. But first, I want to talk about this book. This book sheds crucial new light on the US engagements in Southeast Asia after World War II. And those engagements still shape the lives of so many in Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam, and in the United States today. I read this book last month in preparation for this event, and I found it extremely timely, even though a majority of the events the book explores happened more than 40 years ago. And every time I'm reminded of the facts that the US dropped more bombs on Vietnam than it did during the World War II theaters, many of those bombs hitting non-military targets, my inner core is really shaken. And then this book goes on to remind us that that same statistic was reached in Cambodia and Laos, and that is that the US bombed Cambodia and Laos with more bombs each than what the bombing was. The US bombing was undertaken in World War II. Laos is the most bombed country on the planet of the earth, and all of it was done secretly without ever declaring war on Laos. Total together, the number of civilian casualties in these three countries and across the conflict were in the hundreds of thousands, if not millions. And the book gets into to some of these details. By tying together the Vietnam War and later the 2003 and afterwards invasion of Iraq, along a common thread of unilateral military aggression, the book helps us think through how far US foreign policy has evolved from the days when presidents could carry out secret wars of aggression in Cambodia and Laos. And for years doing this with zero accountability and use their staffers and their powers to escalate conflict, putting more and more American lives at risk for little or uncertain gain. Last week, I listened to an Economist podcast which linked the aggressive military incursions of the Vietnam War and the Iraq War and suggested that the proponents of aggressive military action might have now disappeared from the Washington stage in the post-Iraq, post-Great Financial Crisis era, noting both the anti-war popularity of first Barack Obama and then also, interestingly, Donald Trump's anti-war campaign, so-called anti-war campaign, as factors that got them elected over their opponents who were much more hawkish. And so do we now note that our foreign policy is absent of McNamara's and Kissinger's and Rumsfeld's? Or do those with the ambitions for unilateral aggression still walk the streets of Washington, D.C.? And this is something that the book helps the reader think through. When you read this book, the statistics about the deaths, the injuries, the remaining victims of the conflict affected by unexploded ordnance and Agent Orange exposure are really staggering. And they remind the reader that the US still has so much to do to reconcile in this post-conflict era, more than 40 years on. And administrations, rightfully, since the mid-90s have done much to reconcile with these countries and help these countries heal from the legacies of war. But when I read these statistics, I can't help be reminded of the indifference that Americans tend to take towards statistics like these, noting that now we live in a time of the coronavirus when more than 227,000 Americans have died from the pandemic, and our current leadership plays down and spins these numbers for their own political advantages. The Stimson Center has a long history of working to address the impacts of conflict on civilians and build practical and creative solutions for more sustainable and a peaceful future. Founded in 1989, the Stimson Center has a 30-year track record of working with a broad range of issues to protect people, preserve the planet, promote security and prosperity, and analyze grand strategy in pivotal places. Our Southeast Asia program, which I lead, began work in 2018 on the War Legacies Working Group, which seeks to build partnerships throughout the United States and Southeast Asia to address the consequences of the Vietnam War, including unexploded ordnance, Agent Orange, and mine clearance. Addressing these consequences of war is not only the humanitarian thing to do, it creates opportunities for mutually beneficial partnerships among former enemies, the US-Vietnam relationship, notably one of them. We're honored today to host today's distinguished panelists, including Dr. Noam Chomsky, who has spoken extensively about how memories of the Vietnam War impact US foreign policy. I'm joined today by my colleague and co-moderator, Sarah Calabria. Sarah is the Executive Director of Legacies of War, a nonprofit with the mission to raise awareness about the history of the Vietnam War era bombing in Laos, advocate for the clearance of those unexploded bombs, and create space for healing the wounds of war. Sarah, over to you.
Thank you so much, Brian, my co-moderator and partner in peace. It's such an honor to be here with you all today. And a special thank you to the Stimson Center, along with War Legacies Working Group, which I have the honor of representing Legacies as a member of, for helping to co-host this very special event, webinar and book talk today. Before we begin, I do want to give a special thank you to my team for helping us put together a lot of the questions that I'll be asking our panelists today. So if you don't like it, you can call Alex Heiniger and Titus Peachy, who helped me write these. So thank you, Alex, who's our board chair, and Titus, who's also on our board. So I wanted to also give a warm welcome to our esteemed panelists, who I have the honor and the privilege to help introduce today. After I introduce our panelists, I'll end with Professor Noam Chomsky and pass the baton over to him to share our keynote address today. So without further ado, the first panelist that I'd like to introduce is Professor Ngo Vinh Long. Professor Long received his PhD in East Asian history and Far Eastern languages from Harvard University. He first joined the Department of History at Maine in 1985 and have offered a variety of courses on East Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and the relations of these countries in the region with each other, as well as with the United States. His research has focused on the problems of the peasantry and development in East and Southeast Asia. In recent years, he's paid increasing attention to the questions of development and the roles of government in general. During the 2000 and 2001 academic year, he served as a Fulbright scholar in Vietnam, teaching courses on the history of economic development in East and Southeast Asia since the end of World War II, and the history of foreign relations in East and Southeast Asia since the end of the Cold War. Welcome, Professor Long. Our next panelist is Elaine Russell. Elaine is an award-winning author who writes both fiction and nonfiction work. She first traveled to Laos in 2006 to do research for her novel titled Across the Mekong River, a story of Hmong family fleeing Laos during the Vietnam War era. On this trip was when Elaine first learned of the terrible tragedy of unexploded ordnances, which remains from the US carpet bombing campaigns in Laos during the Secret War. Upon returning home, Elaine volunteered with Legacies of War, and she served on our board for 5 years and continued to support. I will never let you leave, Elaine. Elaine co-authored the third chapter of the United States Southeast Asia Historical Memory, along with Channapha Khamvongsa. The article is titled Legacies of War, Cluster Bombs in Laos, and was first published in the Critical Asian Studies Journal in June of 2009. It has since been updated to reflect new information and progress of the situation of UXO clearance in Laos. Welcome, Elaine. And next is our fearless founder of Legacies of War, Channapha Khamvongsa. Sabaidi. Channapha is, of course, the founder of Legacies of War and former executive director. During her tenure with Legacies, Channapha successfully advocated for an increase in US funding for bomb clearance in Laos and survivor assistance from around $1.3 million in 2004 to $30 million in 2016. This effort was acknowledged by President Barack Obama when he became the first US president to visit Laos, the first sitting US president to visit Laos, and announced $90 million for 3 years for bomb clearance and survivor assistance. Channapha has also written and spoken widely about the Secret War and its aftermath, and appeared in New York Times, Democracy Now!, CNN, PBS, and countless other news outlets. Channapha, like myself, was born in Laos, in Vientiane, and came to the US as a refugee at the age of 7. She received her Bachelor's of Science degree in Public Administration at George Mason University and Master's degree in Public Policy with Georgetown University, where she was honored with the Distinguished Alumni Award. Welcome, Channapha. Next up is Charles Bailey, my fellow War Legacies Working Group member. Charles Bailey has worked for the fullest resolution of Agent Orange legacy in Vietnam since 1997, when the Ford Foundation sent him to live there and head their office in Hanoi. Over time, he gained the confidence of both government, and his work contributed to a breakthrough on Agent Orange in 2006. He has twice been awarded the Vietnam Friendship Medal by the President of Vietnam in 2003 and 2011. Charles is co-author of the book From Enemies to Partners, Vietnam, the US, and Agent Orange, with a Vietnamese physician and toxicologist, Dr. Lee Kong Sun. Welcome, Charles. And our keynote today is Professor Noam Chomsky. Considered the founder of modern linguistics, Professor Noam Chomsky is one of the most cited scholars in modern history. He has transformed the field of linguistics and influenced fields such as cognitive science, philosophy, psychology, computer science, childhood education, and anthropology. He joined the University of Arizona in the fall of 2017, coming from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, or MIT, where he spent more than 55 years as professor and then Institute Professor Emeritus. Professor Chomsky is one of the most influential public intellects in the world. He's written more than 100 books, including At War with Asia, which I just finished, gifted to me from Mark Pavlik. So welcome, Professor Noam Chomsky. You have the floor.
Thank you. It's now 45 years since the end of the Vietnam War, at least the official end. It's not the end of the war for the victims. So there are still hundreds of thousands of people suffering from the effects of human US chemical warfare in South Vietnam. That was one horror that North Vietnam was spared. It was the chemical warfare initiated by John F. Kennedy in 1961, 62, as part of his sharp escalation of the Vietnam War against South Vietnam at that time. The US Air Force was commissioned to start bombing South Vietnamese rural areas under South Vietnamese markings, but no one was fooled. Chemical warfare to destroy crops and livestock, part of the program of trying to drive the rural population into what amounted to concentration camps called strategic hamlets, surrounded by barbed wire, to protect them from the guerrillas, the South Vietnamese guerrillas, who the US intelligence knew very well that they were supporting. That was in fact the problem. The US internal analysts said the problem is the South Vietnamese National Liberation Front, what we call the Viet Cong, was fighting a political war. And they could do that because they had the support of the population. We had no support, so we had to fight a military war. The military war was escalated sharply by Kennedy, then more in later years, expanded to the rest of Indochina by the late 1960s. In Laos, as was just mentioned, the most heavily bombed area, rural areas, far from anything having to do with the Indochina War, including the famous Ho Chi Minh Trail, were bombed so extensively that to this day, children are being killed by picking up the cluster bombs designed to maximize civilian casualties, strewn all over Laos. And in Cambodia, people are still suffering the long-term effects of Henry Kissinger's order 50 years ago, in which he transmitted Nixon's wishes to the Air Force with the words, massive bombing campaign in Cambodia, anything that flies against anything that moves. That's a challenging exercise to try to find anything in the archival record that is such a clear call for mass genocide. Anything that flies against anything that moves. One of the consequences was to turn the Khmer Rouge from a small guerrilla group to a substantial army of enraged peasants. Took their revenge, then comes more. That's Cambodia. North Vietnam was so intensively bombed that the southern part of North Vietnam, where people don't visit, was essentially turned into a moonscape. I happened to visit the northern part, which was bad enough. Well, that's peace. After the war, when the war ended in 1975, of course, everyone had to write a commentary on it. Not quite everyone. Excluded were the people who, George Bundy, the National Security Advisor for Kennedy and Johnson, the people that he described as wild men in the wings. That was an article in 1968 in Foreign Affairs, where he said, of course, there's a lot of debate and discussion about Vietnam, but we'll exclude the wild men in the wings. That is, people who actually question what we're doing. Don't say it's just a mistake or incompetence, but actually go on to question what we're doing. So we'll exclude them. But aside from the wild men in the wings, a whole range of people were able to produce their judgments on the war. And it was an interesting range. It ranged from what we call hawks to doves. The hawks said, we were stabbed in the back by the peace movement. We lost our nerve. If we'd fought harder, we could have won. That's the hawks. Ronald Reagan was one leader. Then at the extreme end, you get the doves. Probably at the far extreme, so I'll keep to that, is Anthony Lewis of the New York Times. Strong, left probably as far to the left as you can possibly go in the mainstream spectrum. He wrote an article in which he said, the Vietnam War began with blundering efforts to do good. Why to do good? Because it's an axiom. You don't have to have any evidence for it. The US was involved, so it was an effort to do good, because it's an axiom that everything we do is an effort to do good. Okay, so he needed no evidence for that. It's just obvious. And why was it a blundering effort? Because it failed. By 1969, he said, it was clear that the war was a disaster, that our effort to bring democracy to South Vietnam could not be achieved at a cost acceptable to us. So that's why it was a disaster. That's the extreme dovish end, okay? Then there's other groups, like the population of the United States. There are careful studies of US public opinion on international relations. The most respected ones are the Chicago Institute of International Affairs, the Council on Foreign Affairs. They do annual careful studies of people's attitudes on foreign affairs. 1975, of course, one of the questions was, what do you think about the war in Vietnam? The answer, 70% of the population said the war was not a mistake. It was fundamentally wrong and immoral. So they're wild men in the wings. 70% of the population are excluded, along with the wild men in the wings who said there's something wrong with destroying 3 countries. That question kept being asked in the polls of the Chicago Council for about 15 years, and the numbers remained about the same. Roughly 2/3 or so said, not a mistake, fundamentally wrong and immoral. Finally, at the end of this process, the director of the program asked an obvious question. What do people mean when they're saying that? Well, it would have been possible to put in a polling question to ask, but that didn't even occur to anyone because the answer is so obvious. He told us, the answer is they think it was too costly for Americans. Maybe. There's another possibility. Maybe they thought it was fundamentally wrong and immoral, not a mistake. But that's a view that it can't even be contemplated. So of course that wasn't asked. Well, that was popular attitudes. Has it changed? Like take the Iraq War. There are criticisms, like President Obama is greatly respected because he described the invasion of Iraq as a strategic blunder. Okay, wonderful statement. He should be put on Mount Rushmore. What he was doing was quoting Nazi generals after Stalingrad, who said two-front war was a strategic blunder, should have knocked out England first. Okay, that's the top most respected position. There are people who think it was fundamentally wrong and immoral. In fact, a war of aggression of the kind that Nazi war criminals were hanged for. But they're out of the discussion. They remain wild men in the wings. There are retrospective studies of the war by some of those involved. The most interesting and important is Robert McNamara's book. McNamara, contrary to what a lot of people think, was at the dovish end of the spectrum. One of the few people in power who actually had serious regrets about what they were doing all the way through and in retrospect. So reading him is a little bit like reading Anthony Lewis. We're seeing as far to the critical end as you can go. And in fact, he was criticized for being too forthcoming, too concerned with the victims. And his book is quite interesting. He cites lots of American intelligence and one outside expert, Bernard Fall, the most respected military historian, Vietnamese historian, the one figure who US intelligence took very seriously. So he quotes Fall. And here's what he says. He says in 1965, when the war was really taking off sharply, Bernard Fall wrote that the war is directed against South Vietnam. It's killed 150,000 people. South Vietnam is being devastated, but it may not. It's the American attack is sharply escalating with high technology war against a civilian population. McNamara writes that this was encouraging news, because Fall was optimistic. He was thinking that the US force could overwhelm the civilian population in South Vietnam. So that was encouraging. 2 years later, right before his death in combat, Bernard Fall wrote something else. He wrote that Vietnam as a cultural and historic entity is threatened with extinction, while in the South, the countryside literally dies under the blows of the largest military machine ever unleashed in an area of this size. McNamara writes that this was no longer encouraging because Fall no longer felt that US technology could prevail. So he had become pessimistic. He was optimistic when he was describing a hideous massacre and denouncing it, but said it might succeed. So that was optimistic. But now he's describing maybe the death, the total extinction of the South, but he doesn't think it's going to work. So he had become pessimistic. Now that's the interpretation at the dovish end of the spectrum. Has it changed? Well, take a look at US relations with Vietnam. Have a look, say, at the Wikipedia entry on this today. Points out, doesn't give the whole story, but I'll add a little. The US imposed an embargo on Vietnam to punish it for not having been totally destroyed under the blows of the largest military machine ever unleashed in an area of this size. So we had to punish it. Intensive embargo. Began to relax a little with President Bush the first, George H.W. Bush. His view was, we're a magnanimous people, so we will agree to somewhat relax the punishment of Vietnam, though we will never forgive the Vietnamese for what they did to us. Okay, that was George H.W. Bush. Then comes the Clinton administration. At that point, John Kerry and John McCain, senators, both veterans of the war, they began to push towards some kind of normalization. But there were problems. The Clinton administration had a problem. One of the problems was the infamous letter that Clinton wrote in 1969 when he expressed opposition to the war. And that infamous letter makes it difficult for him to make the next step towards relaxing the punishment. But there were moves towards normalization. But as George H.W. Bush said, the statesman like Bush, we can never forgive the Vietnamese for what they did to us, or the Laotians, or others who we massacred and destroyed. And nor can we forgive the Iraqis for what they did to us. So what's historical memory? Well, just add one little element to it. There's a media specialist at the University of Massachusetts, Sut Jolly, runs the communication center. It does a lot of public opinion studies. A couple of years ago, he did one with students at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. This is the star university with the elite students. Asked them many questions. One of them was to estimate Vietnamese casualties during the Vietnam War. The median estimate was 100,000. That's about 5% of the official figure, probably 2 or 3% of the actual figure. That's not counting the ones who've been dying after the war. Well, that's historical memory. If you have a well-disciplined propaganda system called intellectual culture, scholarship, media, and so on, these are the attitudes you get. Nevertheless, 70% of Americans thought that the war was fundamentally wrong and immoral, not a mistake. We don't know exactly what they meant because the polling experts couldn't even dream of asking that question because it's so obvious, as Lewis pointed out, that we were involved in blundering efforts to do good, trying to bring democracy to South Vietnam by destroying it and overthrowing every government that didn't obey our commands. But that was what we were doing. That's the official story. And the real question is, can the population become civilized enough to overcome official stories, hawk to dove, and try to look at the facts of what happened, which are amply reported in official documents, in reports by scholars and analysts, people like the late Fred Branfman, who brought the Laos story to our attention, including some pretty astonishing facts. It's facts that range alongside, in my view, of Kissinger's order, anything that flies against anything that moves. Fred discovered that in congressional testimony, the top US officials in Laos explained why they were devastating the rural areas of northern Laos, the Plain of Jars, with massive bombing from which children are still dying. They had a reason. There was a bombing pause in North Vietnam, and they had all this equipment around in the air bases with nothing to do. So they had to have them do something. So what they had them do was devastate the Plain of Jars in northern Laos, scattered villages where half the people didn't even know they were in Laos, no war going on. But we have all these planes around. You can't just let them sit there in the airfields. So there's that. There's anything that moves against anything that flies against anything that moves, chemical warfare to destroy crops and livestock, all blundering efforts to do good and bring democracy to the people. Okay? If we allow that official culture to remain unchallenged, the future is very dim.
Thank you so much, Professor Chomsky, for that incredible comprehensive overview. Now I want to give our panelists, our 4 other panelists, a chance to give us a 3 to 5 minute of opening remarks. I'll start with you, Professor Long. You're on mute.
Now? Yeah, okay. I'll speak a little bit about my piece. The reason why I wrote my piece was because the editor, Mark Pavlik, asked me to write a postscript to Professor Chomsky's piece. Professor Chomsky's piece was first published in a quarterly that I published. And so that's the reason for my piece. Now I picked up where Professor Chomsky left, and that was where his article left with the Mayaways incident in Cambodia. So I picked it up because on the very day that Kissinger was talking about the Mayaways incident and what to do in Cambodia and so forth and so on, he somehow found the time to recommend to the Department of the Treasury, or the Treasury Department, to impose a very strict trade embargo on Vietnam. And the effect of that trade embargo went for many, many years later. So that's why I mentioned about that. The second thing that I mentioned was the fact that, you know, after the, long before the war and after the April 30th, the Vietnamese, both in the authorities, both in the North and the South, said that they wanted Vietnam to be reunified, but only in stages, maybe in 10 years, maybe in 15 years. So therefore, they sent 2 delegations to United Nations and applied to be 2 separate nations. Kissinger, and his advisors and other people wanted to basically veto the Vietnamese application, and they went around it in a very sneaky way that I described in my chapter. So I won't go into that. But in the end, what happened is that by September 30th, 1975, the United States vetoed the two Vietnams application. And what that did was that it enabled the hardline people in Vietnam to force the reunification of Vietnam. Then the trade embargo on Vietnam caused tremendous economic problems. And so the government of Vietnam carried out what was known as the beginning of the cooperativization program. That again caused tremendous problems in Vietnam all the way until about 2000 or so. So these are two very important things here. Then, of course, the cooperativization program got accelerated because of the so-called post-war war, which was the war that the United States supported against Vietnam from 1975 until the Chinese invasion of Vietnam. And the Chinese invasion of Vietnam, of course, was stopped, but it continued until 1985, 86. Many people don't know about that. So anyway, my piece talked very quickly about what happened. And so a lot of people see very visible things, but things that are not visible, they don't see. Even though, and the effect on Vietnam, as well as Laos and Cambodia, continue until way into the mid-2000s. 2005 to be exact. Of course, American individuals like Charles Benoit here and many others helped in Vietnam. But US policies in Vietnam did not change until around 2005, 2006. My piece ended with 2005 when the United States began to change its foreign policy against Vietnam.
Thank you so much, Professor Long. I'll definitely have some follow-up questions to that. Before I allow our next panelist to give some opening remarks, I want to remind our audience to please, if you have questions, submit them now, because we will have we will have 30 minutes of Q&A from the audience side. So next up, I'd like to invite Elaine to give some opening remarks, please.
Okay, we were actually going to start with Channapha, but I can go ahead. And as you mentioned, Sarah, I went to Laos for the first time in 2006 as I was researching the novel I was writing. And I went to Zien Quan and I was on the Plain of Jars with the guide, and we heard explosions going off. And I had no idea that the area was littered completely with these cluster bombs. I had never learned about that before, and I was there during the war. I was in college during the war, so I couldn't believe that I didn't know about it. And to be there and hear those bombs going off was a very emotional experience for me. And so I went home and I searched around because I wanted to do something to help with the situation. And luckily I came upon Legacies of War and Channapha, and she said, great, drew me in. And I got involved as a volunteer and then sat on the board, as you mentioned. So I wanted to help in any way I could, but I wanted to use my writing skills to help. The group was getting organized, and I wanted to help write written materials that would be useful. And so Channapha and I came up with the idea of writing an article that would help reach a little broader audience, because we felt like there was very little available about Laos and what had happened. There were history books, but a lot of them I had looked at didn't even mention the unexploded bombs. And so we wanted to present something that would put it all in context and provide excerpts from studies that were available and the information that was available at the time. And so we wrote our chapter, and I started with a brief history so that we could understand how had Laos gotten to this point, that it was in this war, in this civil war. And because it was so overshadowed by the war in Vietnam and even in Cambodia, that no one knew what had happened in Laos. So we started with that and then tried to consolidate all the information that was available. And it was published in 2009. And at the time, the main studies were from humanitarian organizations like Human Rights Watch and Handicap International. And since then, quite a bit has happened and new information has become available, so which we did update considerably for the chapter in the book. So I think I'll stop with that for the moment and let Channapha talk about it.
Thanks, Elaine. I just first want to thank Legacies and Stimson for putting this together, and for Caroline at Haymarket, the publisher, as well as Mark. You know, we owe him such a gratitude for over really 10 years in the making to pull all the chapters together and to do follow-up interviews. So we're really grateful for your perseverance, Mark. And I'm also really honored to share the panel with Dr. Long, who I've come to learn, you know, in the late 60s, helped to translate a lot of the information that was in Vietnamese, only available in Vietnamese, to a much broader American public, which is a source of inspiration for me for your efforts to increase and broaden the narrative around the war from different perspectives. And of course, Charles, we crossed paths at Ford. And then of course, Professor Chomsky, who I first heard had traveled to Laos from Fred Bramfman. One of my earliest conversations with him, he had brought up the fact that he had hosted, you know, dozens of journalists to meet with the refugees that had fled from Siêng Khoang. And he shared that of all the journalists that he took to the sites to meet with the refugees, only 2 wept. And it was Flora Lewis of the New York Times and you, Professor Chomsky. And that was early on, before Legacies was even started. And it was really a source of inspiration to learn that so many Americans had cared. So many Americans had tried to stop the bombings and to stop the war. And, you know, this was in the 80s when I was growing up. You know, none of this information was available to me, and I was only 8 years old. And growing up in a refugee community, you know, you really don't talk about the past. Your parents don't talk about the past. And so there wasn't a lot that we knew in the broader context of why we came to the US. When people did speak, it was about their personal history, and often that was quite fragmented. And so we didn't understand how our personal and family histories were connected to this much broader American context. And so when I met Fred, it was really eye-opening because it gave me an opportunity to look at things that were happening before I was even born. And Voices from the Plain of Jars was a source of inspiration and influence in wanting to learn more. But we also, you know, realized that was testimonial from civilians, you know, from the 60s and 70s, and that we needed to update the information because people were still being killed and maimed, but we didn't know to what extent. And so when Elaine and I started talking about how we could better educate the American public today, we had to dig back into not only the history, but to get as much information as possible about what was being done so that we can continue to be helpful in this history and in this process. And so that's how the chapter came about. So in 2009, as Elaine mentioned, when this was first published, the US was providing merely about 3 million. And then in 2010, there was tremendous congressional leadership through Senator Leahy and his staff, Tim Reeser, as well as on the House side, Congressman Honda and Falama Vega helped to host the first congressional hearing on UXO in Laos, which really helped to educate and document and have in congressional, records what was happening today, and along with folks like Mag and others who helped to testify. And as a result of those efforts, and in addition, former US ambassadors from Laos engaged by writing a letter to then Secretary Clinton, imploring her to support, for the US to do more to support the UXO issue. And so that was the first time that then funding was designated to Laos, and it went to 5 million. So it was from 3 million to 5 million. And then at that time, the Lao government was developing a national plan to help address the UXO issue. And so there were collaboration and will to want to address this issue, both here in the US as well as in Laos, obviously. And then after that, we continued to have congressional leadership. In 2011 and beyond, money went from 7 million to then 9 million. And then in 2014, it was 12 million. And during those years, not only was Laos seen an increase in funding, but funding for demining in Cambodia and in Vietnam also received increased support. And so there was a recognition of not only Laos, but a regional effort to try to address war legacies. And then, of course, in 2016, with President Obama's visit, he made the $90 million commitment, which was the first multi-year commitment, and doubling the funding from 15 to 30 million. And so our hope, when we, in the end of the chapter, was that that legacies and the partners continue to look at sort of what we consider the principles for reconciliation and how we would move forward. And these included accepting responsibility, joint commitment from both sides, a comprehensive plan, continued collaboration and partnership, not only amongst governments, but also NGOs, and then transparency of funding and decisions that were being made. And so that continues to be the principles by which we track the progress of the funding and hopefully bringing a sense of peace and safety to the people of Laos for future generations. I'll stop there, Sarah.
Thank you so much for that, Elaine and Channapha. Charles, I'd like to invite you to please share some opening remarks as it relates to Agent Orange. Oh, you're also mute, Charles.
Well, thank you, Sarah, and many thanks to all the previous speakers, particularly Professor Chomsky, who expresses things in such a clear and forceful way. I first went to Asia at the height of the Vietnam War as a Peace Corps volunteer in Nepal. And I'd been there in a remote hill village teaching agriculture. One day I was showing the 6th graders how to use a knapsack sprayer, and some 10th graders came along and said, "Oh, that's just how you Americans are killing all the forests in Vietnam." I was stunned. I couldn't believe it. 30 years later, almost to the day, I'm in Vietnam in the Central Highlands, in areas that indeed are still showing the signs of the terrible devastation. And I recalled this incident and I said, boy, they were right. In any event, that Agent Orange was first my evening job with the Ford Foundation, and then it became my daytime job. I particularly appreciate the chance to talk about this excellent book, the essays on America's Indochina Wars. Professor Tuan Nguyen's chapter is about Agent Orange. It's very useful. And I'm going to give you a short update on Agent Orange and the US-Vietnam relationship today. And I want to make 3 points. First, The two countries remained directly deadlocked in Agent Orange for 21 years, from the establishment of diplomatic relations in 1995 until a breakthrough occurred in 2006. Second, US assistance to Vietnam and Agent Orange began a year later in 2007, thanks to Senator Patrick Leahy, who made this his personal commitment. It still depends on him. And third, while there is progress on Agent Orange, just a lot remains to be done. The dioxin in Agent Orange has indirectly impacted several 100,000 young Vietnamese born and living with severe disabilities. They are the victims of Agent Orange. Well, about the deadlock. Before and after diplomatic relations in 1995, the US just wouldn't talk about Agent Orange with the Vietnamese. And when they finally did begin to talk about 2000, 2002, it just led to further recriminations and serious ill feelings on both sides. The real breakthrough came in 2006 when a Canadian study funded by the Ford Foundation showed that residual dioxin was at threatening levels at just a handful of former American air bases. They could be prioritized for cleanup. Both countries accepted these findings. Now about the assistance. US assistance began in 2007, and since then our aid has walked forward on two legs, helping the afflicted and cleaning up the contaminated air bases. From 2007 to today, US annual appropriations for Agent Orange in Vietnam have totaled $350 million, a quarter of it for disability assistance and 3/4 for air-based cleanup. Disability assistance is currently running at $13 million a year, and USAID is channeling these funds to 8 provinces which were especially heavily sprayed in central and southern Vietnam. Within those 8 provinces, they give priority to selected Vietnamese with severe physical and cognitive disabilities. But there's another issue. Unlike funding for unexploded ordnance, successive administrations, from Bush to Obama to Trump, have never put funding for Agent Orange into the president's annual budgets. They have left it to Senator Leahy to do so in the annual appropriations process after the president's budget reaches the Congress. Without Leahy's commitment and seniority, it would be a tricky business to keep it going. And finally, my third point, we're really just at the beginning. We just started. So what do we need to do now? We need to build, ask, and advocate. We need to build wider support among appropriators in both the Senate and the House. We need to ask USAID to show success in its disability assistance. And we need to advocate for sharply increased annual appropriations for disability assistance so that it reaches far more of Vietnam's victims of Agent Orange. We could easily double or treble the current allocation of $13 million a year, and it would still be decimal dust in the federal budget. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charles, for that. So in the interest of time, I know that there's been a number of questions coming in directed at Professor Chomsky and Professor Long on Vietnam. So what I like to do is just ask 2 questions before I hand the mic over to Brian. My first question, Elaine and Channapha, you're going to be in the hot seat again. I wanted to ask, we know that there were 580,000 bombing missions that flew over Laos. That's equal to over 2.1 million tons of bombs, equaling a plane load of bomb for 24 hours a day, every 8 minutes for 9 straight years. What can we as Americans learn from the experiences in Laos that might help us prevent another secret war? So whichever one of you would like to take a stab first.
Oh, wow. How many minutes or hours do we have?
We have the whole day.
I think, what was interesting was when Legacies was started in 2004, it was in the midst of the Iraq wars, right? And we were able to share the long-term impact of war in Laos to try to prevent other US conflicts. And I think what the case of Laos has taught many who read about it or learn about it is just how devastating, and for all of Southeast Asia and the wars there, it's just how long-term, it's not just physical, it's the emotional toll of war, and it cuts across generations. And for us who are part of the refugee population and communities who have resettled here in the US, you have millions, of Americans now who still remember or have heard from their parents what happened, and are now, I think, are in positions to be engaged politically, right? Whereas when we first came to the US, you didn't get involved with politics. You stayed away from politics because that's what got us into this. But I think what's been remarkable is through the generations, the activism is now being rebirthed, and amongst the now, refugee community, now immigrant community, now Americans, now citizens. And so I think there's a lot of that experience of coming from war to hopefully influence elections and policies that will improve the United States American foreign policy in a way that does less harm around the world.
Let me just add a word. There's what apparently is a historical universal, or very close to it. If a country isn't defeated, its cultural institutions never concede or recognize the atrocities they've carried out. You go to England, British triumphalism has reigned in the school system, the scholarship, till very recently. It's only recently, in the last few years, that Britain has started barely to come to terms with atrocities that go back centuries. France, almost nothing about you don't read about the French, you read about France's civilizing mission in Africa, if you're French, but you don't read about the orders of the French commanding general around the 1880s to exterminate everyone because they're rising up against France. Country after country is the same. The United States, you've all seen, I'm sure, the 1619 project at the New York Times, which caused a great backlash. How dare you? They were commemorating 400 years of vicious slavery, the worst in human history, an aftermath of horrible repression lasting until today, an awful legacy. Finally did it. Why? Because public consciousness and pressure had increased. Took 400 years, but it's there. We saw it burst out after the George Floyd murder. And maybe that can happen. Maybe the United States can be an exception. Maybe we can reach a level of civilization which allows us to face the crimes and atrocities for which we have been responsible. Maybe there's some hope. The younger generation shows signs of it. And I think that's the optimistic side of this grim and sadistic story.
Thank you, Professor Chomsky. On that note, I do have a question to follow up to that. I know that during the war in Southeast Asia and afterwards, people have worked and are still doing so to resolve some of the lasting negative impacts that UXO and Agent Orange has posed on the three countries that we're speaking about today. What can today's social movements learn from the protests that happened during the war? And what are other ways that groups like ours, the War Legacies Working Groups, and the US campaign to ban landmines, US cluster munition, coalition cluster munition, do to make lasting change?
There aren't any magic keys. The answers are always the same, whether it was abolitionism, women's rights, opposition to aggression, environmental crisis, whatever you pick. The answers are in front of us, nothing new, education, organizing, taking actions that are appropriate to the situation, that judge the circumstances and ask what will be effective. Over time, it has an effect. Just take a look at the United States. Not your memory, but easily mine. In the 1960s, what was the United States like? Well, the United States had laws against miscegenation, which were so extreme that the Nazis refused to accept them. They only accepted a watered down version of them. Federal laws barred Blacks from federally supported housing. Okay. Not because the legislators wanted that, but because that was the only way to get any public housing through Congress. The Southern Democrats would kill anything that gave anything to Blacks. Social Security has been a very successful project, except that 40% of American workers were excluded from it, namely those in employment where it was mostly Black, domestic service, agricultural workers. They had to be excluded to get any Social Security, 40% of the workforce. That was the 60s, actually, that still is. Women were not regarded as peers having the rights of citizens. Didn't happen until 1975. There were, of course, anti-sodomy laws lasting until this century. That's the United States not many years ago. A lot of this is just unspeakable today. Why did it happen? Because of the wild men in the wings, those who are bitterly condemned at the time, finally had an impact. Took time, but it did. And the same is true now. This has been true throughout history. It's the wild men in the wings who've made a difference.
Thank you, Professor Chomsky. You heard it, folks. Advocate, continue to meet and gather, and very important in this upcoming election, to vote. I have one last question before I pass it off to Brian. And this one is actually for you, Professor Chomsky, again. I know you were in Laos as well as Vietnam and in the region during 68, 69 with ICC, or International Control Commission. And there, in Fred's interview, he mentioned you rode on a motorbike with him in the back seat. Did he ever allow you to be in the front seat? And I said during 1968 to 1969, you were part of ICC. You took a trip to Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam with the International Control Commission. Fred mentioned in his interview that you both rode on a motorbike. Did he ever allow you to take the wheels?
Oh, no. I was on the back of his motorbike, hanging on for dear life. I wouldn't come near the wheels. I was there in Laos for a week, very informative. The reason I was in Laos was because the Indian bureaucrat who supervised the weekly trips to North Vietnam was bored out of his life. And the only way he could amuse himself was by making life difficult for people who were trying to do something, standard bureaucratic procedure. So he could delay. There was a weekly trip from Vientiane to Hanoi. It flew through a UN special airspace, when a propeller plane. When you were flying through it, you saw jet planes zooming around all over the place, but this was a protected corridor. And so I had, since he wanted to delay us, I stayed in Laos, which turned out to be very useful. When I landed at the airport, Fred was there. I hadn't known him, but we met each other. We spent practically the whole week together. And I found out all sorts of things which were available to anybody who wanted to find out. It wasn't deep secret. It was all on the surface. I should say that the week I was there, Laos, Vientiane was flooded with international reporters, leading journalists from major journals all around the world. Why? Because Richard Nixon had made a speech in which he said that North Vietnamese tanks were approaching Vientiane and North Vietnam was going to conquer the country. So the whole international press corps flew in. I don't know if you've ever dealt with the international press corps, but in a country, in say Vientiane, there are 2 hotels where foreigners would be. So, and the journalists were all in these 2 hotels. Most of the time they spent in the hotel bar talking to each other. And then at 5 o'clock, they would all go to what was called the 5 o'clock follies, where you would go to the American embassy and get the official news. North Vietnamese tanks coming to Vientiane, write the articles, go back to the hotel, have a drink in the bar and laugh about how ludicrous all of this is, because of course none of it's happening. And they all knew it, but they reported the things. I remember one morning I was at the London Hotel. I got up at 6. There were a group of men there, Americans, blonde, blue-eyed, tall, kept to themselves, came at 6 o'clock in the morning. They came, had breakfast, disappeared, came back in the evening, had a drink, disappeared. Every journalist knew who they were. They were pilots for Air America, the pilots who were flying the murderous missions. I don't think a single journalist ever talked to them or asked or reported about them even. It's, Fred took me to the refugee camps were about 30 kilometers outside of Vientiane. Not a long trip. We made it on his motorbike. But the only journalist who came with us was a stringer for the Far East Economic Review. They were all there. That's the story of what was happening in the Plain of Jars. I mean, there were actually 1 or 2 journalists who went on the run, but the press corps just wasn't interested. That's not the story. I've seen the same in other countries. Journalists do their work with courage and integrity, but they're not looking for the things that'll tell the wrong story. So that's why nobody knew about it. I mean, there were a few. Harrison Salisbury reported, 1 or 2 others, but almost nothing. So most people just didn't know. And if you don't know, you can't protest and you can't object. It's much the same in other cases.
Well, thank goodness for those who spoke up. Well, thank you so much for that. And it is now time for me to officially pass the mic back to Brian for audience Q&A.
Thank you, Sarah. And Professor Chomsky, it's just fascinating to listen to you channel us back to the late 60s, to your visit to Laos. I'm going to keep us in history a bit and also ask a question. I'm going to combine 4 questions and pose it to Professor Chomsky, and also invite anyone else to answer afterwards to this broad question, which then has 3 kind of detailed follow-ups. You can see how they're all going to fit together. A question comes from Mary Ann Mendoza of what approaches should we take to ensure that our students who are increasingly further away in time from the war each year adequately learn about what happened during this time? And then there are 3 kind of sub-questions that come with this. One is that someone asked, why didn't the governments of these countries, of Laos or Cambodia, do anything about the bombings? Why didn't they try to stop the bombings? Another question is we've read that the US offered early in the 50s and then later considering the first offering the use of atomic bombs to France to end the war in the 1950s in Vietnam, and then perhaps considered it later. What is there any truth behind this? And then third, the question is could these corrupt puppet governments that were set up by the United States at the time actually be transitioned to successful governing bodies and that were democratic? I'll turn this to Professor Chomsky first and then see if anyone else would like to answer.
Well, let's take Laos. Actually, one of the things that I did with Fred when I was traveling around Laos was to meet with cabinet members of the government. It was a right-wing government installed and backed by the United States. One of the cabinet members, he didn't want me to, I wrote about him, but he didn't want to be referred to by name. So I just described him as an urban intellectual. That's how he wanted to be. But he was actually the Minister of Urban Affairs, a rich landowner. Talked to him quite frankly. He said he hoped that the Pathet Lao, the guerrillas, would win. He hated them. They were going to kill him. They were going to steal his land, take his land. He's a rich landowner. But he hoped that they would win, because that's the only way that Laos could be preserved as an independent country with an independent culture and society. Okay, that's the cabinet. We met with Suvarnabhuma, who was technically in charge, the rich landowner, right-winger. We asked him, I was there with a couple of friends, also going to North Vietnam. We asked him, what do you think about the bombing in northern Laos, intensive bombing? He said, it's not happening. That's all. There's nothing to say about it. It's not happening. It's just that the area is being invaded by North Vietnam, but there's no bombing. Okay. Now you ask, what are they going to do about it? First of all, they're in the pocket of the United States, but suppose they were independent. Take a look at the current world right now in front of your eyes, okay? Let's take US sanctions against Iran, murderous sanctions designed to torture the people of Vietnam, of Iran, killing who knows how many of them. What does the rest of the world think about this? They're opposed to it. The United States just went to the Security Council of the United Nations requesting that the Security Council renew UN sanctions against Iran. Total opposition. Not a single US ally agreed. Total. So what happened? Secretary of State Mike Pompeo went back to the Security Council and said, sorry, folks, the sanctions are reinstituted. Germany, France, other European countries are strongly opposed. Are they doing anything about it? No. The world is run like the mafia. If the Godfather says something, you're in trouble if you don't obey. In this case, the United States can throw them out of the international financial system. So they observe the sanctions. The US has had murderous sanctions against Cuba for 60 years. Entire world is opposed. Look at the vote. There's annual votes in the UN General Assembly. You can't have it in the Security Council, the US vetoes it. But in the General Assembly, they have annual votes. 100% opposition. Israel is the only country that votes with the United States. That's because they have to. Does it matter? No. We impose the sanctions. The whole world adheres to the sanctions, because if they don't, they'll be punished, and punished severely. Okay? Now, when you ask, Why don't small countries stand up to the United States? Why didn't Poland stand up to Russia when it was occupied by Russia? I mean, maybe they wanted to, but what happens if you do? Well, that's most of the world. Now, that's one of the things that Americans ought to learn about. This recent power play at the Security Council, that ought to be front page news in a free society. Let's learn about ourselves. We're a society which can pick up the bludgeon, smash anyone in the head, and they say, thank you. Okay, we should know about that.
Thank you. Do any other panelists want to comment on what can we do today to, as the distance increases from the end of the conflict, to remind our youth about the legacies of war?
I would just mention that I've spoken at a number of high schools, and when I look at their textbooks and I see what they have in there, they have this little short section on the Vietnam War, and it may be one sentence that mentions Laos. The kids have absolutely no idea what happened there, what went on, and they can't put it into context to what's going on in their lifetime. So I think there should be a real emphasis on trying to improve education at the high school and college level, to have materials that are, I'm sure at the college level they may be better, but certainly at the high school level, there needs to be a real change in how the textbooks and the teachers are presenting all of this so that they can understand better. Just my thought.
I should say that it's an experience that I have very often. And when I talk to classes or students or others about these things, the first thing I do is think to myself, when I was a college undergraduate, how would I have felt if some professor came in and started telling me about his experiences during the Civil War? That puts you in the right context.
We're going to go to some more pointed questions now about Agent Orange and UXO clearance and contamination. And first, I think this one goes to those of you who are working on increasing U.S. remediation of Agent Orange and finding the bombs and clearing the bombs. It has to do with how this is kind of pitched. Often that the American public, the appeal to disability and what disabilities look like. So the question is that typically this is couched or framed in terms of grotesqueness or disgust. How can we move past this, mobilize activism around the issue? And I think Agent Orange also continues with this, without fetishizing disability. I think this is a question for Channapha or Charles or Elaine.
Yeah, I think it's increasing and expanding the narrative about who gets to tell the stories, right? Who gets to talk about the experiences of what is happening in Laos or Cambodia or Vietnam. And one of the things that Legacies did several years ago was actually bring a survivor as well as a deminer to the US. We did a 12-city tour, 17 events around the country, where Americans could hear directly from those who are living and dealing with these issues. And that's the most important voice, frankly. And so for us, that helps to humanize, not only humanize, right? But also it doesn't weaken, right? The perspective of those who are directly affected. And so, Legacies in my mind, when we created this, was to diversify the voices around the legacies in Southeast Asia. and to help support and provide a platform to empower those who are directly affected. Because I think for so long, we know that the West dominates the narrative. Individuals here dominate the narrative. The press here dominates the narrative. But if we can help to provide a platform to bring other voices that are often not heard from, I think that will help in not seeing those who are on the ground as victims, but those who are also capable of determining their own destiny and future for their families and communities and country. And so I think that's one strategy that we've always implemented through Legacies, and I hope we'll continue to do so.
May I say something about the effect of Agent Orange and other chemicals here? We, at the present time, tend to stress the birth defects and things like that. But one of the biggest effect of the so-called defoliation program in Vietnam was to strip the forest of its vegetation and kill a lot of trees. There are a lot of floods in Vietnam right now, especially in the central part of Vietnam. Some of that, of course, has to do with the cutting down of the forest in recent years. Some of that has to do with climate change, but a lot of that had to do with the defoliation program. I used to be a military map maker in Vietnam from 1959 to 1963. And during that time, the prime forest went all the way down to the railroad and to Highway 1. And any of you who want to do research, you can look at the U2 aerial maps, which is 1/40,000, and you can see that this is a fact. After the war ended, when I returned to Vietnam, most of the hillsides were denuded. So in the past, when you had rain, it took 2 weeks for the rain from the mountains to go down to the lowland. After the war, it took only 6 or 7 hours. And although the Vietnamese tried to reforest a lot of the denuded areas, of course, as I said, they cut the prime forest. And this is the reason why every year we have a lot of flash floods and we have a lot of people killed by the flash floods. So those who are interested in environmental damage can also bring this thing to the public.
Let me just add very good points. Thank you, Professor Long and Channapha. Let me go back to this question of Brian's on how to pitch it. Some years ago, I organized and we funded a national survey of what people knew about Agent Orange in the United States. And we found several things very briefly. One, that nearly 80% of the respondents across the country knew about it. 60% correctly identified the phrase with Vietnam, and about 1% knew that it was a current problem. And this has continued to be the case as I tried to get major media to focus on some of the current stories about it. It's very hard, I would say, in over a decade of trying, no major media. There's always second-tier regional publications, radio or TV or podcasts. And I think that's reflected also in the what is now a sort of a split in the path within the State Department and the US government. On the one hand, the Department of Defense is now helping to fund the cleanup of the massive dioxin spills at the Bien Hoa airport, along with the State Department. And they see this as promoting mill-mill cooperation, and this is good for a variety of obvious reasons. On the other hand, the disability assistance it's now been 13 years, and people continue to drag their feet, or if they don't drag their feet, they get lost in the details of what should be fairly straightforward. It's not rocket science. $1,000 per family would transform the life prospects of many people. So I think it really comes down to does U.S. foreign policy in any way respond to what Americans think, Professor Chomsky's point. And I think that we're not there yet. I'm not sure when we will be there. There are still many people who are hung up on this question of causality or are somehow stuck in the past. There's been progress, but it's tough sledding to get this, the prospects and the possibilities and the need, indeed the moral imperative for helping Agent Orange victims squarely before the American people.
Charles, I want to follow up on this with Agent Orange victims. And one of our attendees had asked about how Agent Orange impacts the body. Is it something that is an acute and primary impact, or can it be passed from generation to generation? And also, I just want to bring in another question on that came up. It was the first question that popped into our Q&A tab. And then Dr. Long and Professor Chomsky noted on it. It's that the U.S. Has refused to share bombing maps to aid bomb clearance and perhaps some of the Agent Orange spraying routes. But this is has the U.S. administration kind of opened this up or moving forward to provide more information to improve cleanup?
Oh yes, that happened well over a decade ago. In fact, the bombing spraying runs. I can speak less about the bombing. And now this last year, the U.S. Senator Leahy has added money to assist the Vietnamese with finding their own missing in action through setting up genetic testing laboratories and various other things. And this is another positive step forward. But in terms of where the spraying was carried out, yes, on our website, you can find all that information. The Vietnamese have had it for over a decade. Now, on the other question about the impacts, health impacts, I think you can distinguish between people who are directly exposed, that is, who are on the ground and alive, particularly in 68, 69, the height of the spraying, and then went on to have children, and the indirectly exposed, their offspring, or the offspring of a much smaller number of people who have been living around 2 or 3 dioxin hotspots, these former US bases that are being cleaned up. And in the first group, it's really the same story as with our own veterans of the Vietnam War. They use the same list of diseases to qualify them. The government of Vietnam spends about $230 million a year assisting people who have these maladies and diseases and complications, both the directly exposed and their children and grandchildren. The science is often in dispute, but the overwhelming burden of people who are born severely disabled and the fact that it is unusually high incidence in areas that were heavily sprayed, despite the passage of 50 years, is important to consider, and most of all, the feelings of the Vietnamese people who believe that something should be done. The US has dragged its feet. It's now beginning to do something, but more would be very welcome.
And Brian, just on the data strike records for Laos and I think Cambodia as well, there was declassified data strike records under Clinton. It was released. And then as part of the 90 million Obama commitment, there's a national survey that's also taking place in Laos to get updated information around where the actual effectiveness of clearance will be, since we also know that the data strike records weren't always accurate.
Thank you for that. We're going to move into the final portion of our, to close this event down. I think we'll go to about 35 after the hour. And I'm going to ask Professor Chomsky a final set of questions that, again, are kind of a composite of numerous questions that have come in. If you're paying attention to the Q&A list, a good 30% have to do with great power competition and increasing tensions between US and China. So I'm going to start with Cambodia. I was part of a conference, a public conference 2 days ago, where U.S. Ambassador to Cambodia, Patrick Murphy, whom I'm a big fan of, was talking about the Mekong region and US engagement in the Mekong, which has ticked up recently, energy engagement. Obviously, we've been talking about war legacy engagement as well, and major improvements there. The list actually grows quite long. And he said clearly that the Mekong region for US foreign policy is not a sideshow. And when that word sideshow popped out, automatically I thought about how Nixon described the war, the US bombing in Cambodia and our actions there, which were a part of great power competition, and then resulted, the subsequent results were also kind of a residual effect, a horrible residual effect of great power competition. I wonder if you could run us through this very briefly, and then also perhaps expound a bit on US decline, whether a US in decline will be likely to take on a more aggressive policy in the Pacific, in the Indo-Pacific and Southeast Asia, and what Southeast Asian countries can do to prevent a new Cold War or more conflicts from happening.
Since you mentioned the Mekong Delta, it's worth bearing in mind the analyses by prominent climate scientists. The Mekong Delta is facing a disaster. The Mekong Delta has rivers pouring in, which have been able to hold back the sea, making the region very fertile because it was irrigated by the waters. That's declining. The rivers are declining, partly dams, partly global warming. The sea is encroaching. The whole region may become unlivable. And don't forget that when you talk about policy, the United States is alone in the world in moving to accelerate the rate of the devastation from global warming. That has to be changed. Has to be changed on November 3rd. It's coming very close. What about American decline? Well, it's true that the 4 years of President Trump have significantly harmed the United States in the world system. It's now considerably less influential than it was when Trump came in, but it has enormous power. What just happened at the Security Council, as I mentioned a few weeks ago, is one of many illustrations. There's plenty of things wrong with China, real crimes being committed internally, harsh authoritarian state, many crimes, lots to question about their foreign policy. But the fact of the matter is they're not alone. We have plenty to answer for too. I don't usually agree with President Trump, but when he answered a question about what are you going to do about, Russian crimes or something, he said, we have some to answer for too. He was harshly attacked for that. That's one of the sanest comments in his administration. But we have to cooperate. That's a fact. If we don't cooperate with China, we all fall into the dust. Every major issue, whether it's the pandemic, global warming, nuclear war, you name it, these are international problems. And the two major international forces are the United States and China. The United States is much more powerful. Its reach around the world is much greater. We should bear in mind, for example, that 50% of world wealth is in the hands of multinational corporations based in the United States, basically owning half the world. There's never been any power like this in history, but it is declining. And we can make it decline, we can make it benign. We have to work together with China on issues of critical importance to all of us. The China bashing that's going on This is bipartisan, incidentally. It just has to stop. We have to work with China if you can't think of others, even for our own benefit. So there has to be a sharp reversal in these policies. There's plenty of things that China should do. We can't do much about them. There's a lot that we can do. We can do a great deal about it. And one of the things we have to do is move towards cooperation with the other major great power. I don't think there's any alternative to that if we hope to survive.
Thank you, Professor Chomsky. It's been a real honor to host you here. I think on behalf of my co-facilitator, Sarah Calabria, and myself, we've learned so much from your commentary. You remind us that we do have better angels inside of us, but also shed light on the darkness too that can come forward. This has been a real treat and a real learning experience. And I also want to extend a thank you to all of our panelists who have brought in some very pointed issues and very relevant issues of the need to continue to remediate the legacies of war that will continue to linger. Everyone else, I encourage you all to find this book. We've dropped the link into the chat line. The United States, Southeast Asia, and Historical Memory, edited by Mark Pavlik and Carolyn Luft, as well as Charles Bailey's book and Lei Song's book, From Enemies to Partners. Both came out last year. Excellent reads on the remaining legacies of war. So on behalf of the Stimson Center and the War Legacies Group, I want to thank you all for attending, and follow us on our website and on Twitter for more events for the War Legacies Working Group, as well as the Stimson Center at large. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.